Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe, and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome all of you to an encore presentation with Professor Dr. Stefan Fröhlich. He's professor of international politics and political economy at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. Herzlich willkommen, Stefan. It's great to have you back again.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks a lot.
So when I say it's great to have you back again, it's because it feels like it was just yesterday, but really it was mid-January that we had a chance to talk a little bit about the historic significance of Chancellor Olaf Scholz's Zeitenwende speech, but we also talked about the implementation and the fundamentals of this shift in German foreign, security, and energy policy. And in that conversation, Stefan, you talked about some of the real sticking points in Germany's ability to address today's complex global challenges. And at the end of our conversation, even though we covered a broad range of topics and issues, I really felt like there were many questions that we left unanswered. And so it seemed like it was a good opportunity to have you come back to talk with us about the complex security, geopolitical, and geoeconomic challenges that exist, but also what the path forward might be. And so I'd like to start by asking you to pick up on a theme that we talked about two weeks ago or so. You identified the real significance of the speech that Olaf Scholz made, but you also said we're not where we hoped to be. We're not where we need to be. And I wanted to push you a little bit on that because, of course, last year, 2023, was a big year for the development of strategies in Germany. The German government released a national security strategy, a China strategy, and a strategy on energy. And taken together, these three strategies really sort of try to address some of the challenges that Olaf Scholz was referring to in his Zeitenwende speech. One of the criticisms, of course, was that these strategies are a wonderful Bestandsaufnahme or assessment of where we are right now, but that maybe they don't go far enough in terms of what needs to be done. But I thought that would be an interesting place to start because a lot of work was done to develop these strategies. And I'd love to get your assessment on how you see the strategies and where you think we are today versus where you think we need to be.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thanks for this introduction. Yes, and starting with that, actually, let me begin by saying it's good and it's nice to have strategies, and as a matter of fact, and we do not too often we never had actually a similar situation or comparable to what we are in right now, I would say, in terms of, drafting new strategies, outlines, strategy concept on economic security, on military security, on defense, on energy, and so forth. So it's actually they're almost mushrooming in these days, or at least the last 2 years, not only in Germany, but I would say particularly also on the EU level. So, but the thing is, words and deeds are sometimes, two separate things. And the crucial thing is these strategies have to be implemented, and you need, of course, a political willingness to do so. So I would definitely say that we are in the middle of a paradigm shift currently, not only in Germany's foreign security policy, but also in particular, I would say, and would add to, on the EU level. And so maybe let's go through the three key issues you already mentioned: the strategic, the security challenge, the economic challenge, the systemic challenge, we all already touched upon last time. We wanted to dive a little bit more, as we said and agreed, into the implementation of the challenges. What do we need to do, and particularly against the background of this unique year? I would say we all know that there are a couple of important elections coming up, and we all know that there's great concern, of course, here in this country and throughout Europe to how things will develop, particularly on the other side of the Atlantic. We all know that we want to, and Europeans keep on arguing that we want to preserve, of course, this transatlantic relationship. But I think we need to be very careful, and we need to urgently prepare, maybe even also for a weakened one. We do not know what comes at the end of this year. And I'm always telling also my colleagues and friends here throughout Europe, get the expectations right, even if we'll end up in what everybody hopes here, and the majority, of course, the overwhelming majority hopes for Biden will prevail, and there will be a second Biden administration. Nevertheless, even in this case, we should not be. I think that's something we also touched upon and mentioned last time. We should also be aware that the US is also undergoing a fundamental paradigm shift domestically, and also with regard to its global ambitions. Let me put it this way. Let me start with the first challenge. What do we need to do? I think if you look at the situation in Ukraine, everybody is saying it, everybody is pointing to it, and there is a huge debate here also in Germany, of course, on that issue. We all know that Europeans must invest more into defense. We now are quite optimistic because we just had a 53 billion, as you probably heard, dollar aid package to the Ukraine, which has been finally accepted and agreed upon by the European member states. That was certainly a right step and an extremely important one at that point. But we should, of course, keep in mind this is basically money over the next 4 years, and to help particularly rebuild Ukraine shattered by Russia's invasion. So it's important, but it's certainly not enough. The same goes, and the same is true if you look at particular Germany. I think we still have this paradoxical situation. Germany has done a lot in the last 2 years, but I'm absolutely convinced that it should take the lead. But I think this should not be done by, let's say, how can you say, patting ourselves on the back for being the second largest provider of military, as our chancellor just recently reminded his European colleagues of, and economic aid so far. We should also not. It's of course fair to do so. Push Italy and France to do more, maybe, and invest more. That is all true, but the key question, the crucial question, is asking what the Ukraine needs to prevail in this war of attrition. That is the real question, and here we, I think, still send mixed signals politically. I think it's necessary to send a clearer signal that we are not trying to press Zelensky into any kind of negotiations with Russia, and to hold up to an illusion that maybe there will be another Minsk agreement. That is an illusion, as long as Putin threatens the very existence of the Ukraine, and this hasn't changed at all. So I think that is extremely relevant. So the 53 billion, wonderful, good. But at the same time, the chancellor still refuses to send Taurus missiles. And this is exactly what the Ukraine, this will not be maybe the crucial game changer, but it will help a lot. And I think you probably heard that the German parliament was just recently rejected of the rejection of a motion by the center-right opposition, which called for doing so. And I think that was, again, the wrong signal. And Scholz's concern still is that this could potentially draw Germany into the war. But this is not convincing at all. It doesn't matter what we supply or do or not supply. I think it only matters what Putin decides at that point, at that stage, and that is crucial. So we need to do more militarily. That means it's all true that we, of course, also need that Ukraine needs more ammunition. Kiev needs an estimated 2 million rounds of ammunition per year. It also needs, of course, replacement artillery barrels, spare parts, air defense systems. But what is also crucial on top of it is still ground-to-air and air-to-air missiles, as a matter of fact. And Ukraine has been asking for it for a long time. And I'm also warning here many of my colleagues constantly. We've never thought about the fact what if the Ukraine does not receive the help it needs, how could that end? And what kind of costs might that actually imply? I do not see the discussions here. What happens if we will all of a sudden, if the Ukraine cannot withstand, let's say, Russia, what will we do with approximately estimated 10 million refugees coming from a war-torn zone? This will happen. And believe me, this will exceed the costs of investing now into the necessary military equipment. So this is a discussion we need to have.
And I think we're having the same debate in the US as well about
definitely,
that, obviously, as you know.
Definitely. So that means we have to do that now. We need to ramp up the production and procurement of material to support the Ukraine. Europe must expand its ability to produce ammunition and other critical weapons now, instead of hoping for the best regarding the outcome of the elections, let's say, in Washington by the end of the year. And I would like to clarify here and point out that I think sometimes it's underestimated that some of the world's foremost armament producers are European. And boosting their capabilities is practically and financially within reach. It's not it's not an illusion, but it will require much more, of course, planning. So that is what we need to do. And this is something we need also for ourselves, because, of course, we are in a detrimental situation because European armies also due, of course, to the deliveries to Ukraine need to reconstitute their defense supplies and address shortfalls for themselves.
But Stefan, let me push you on this just a little bit. You've obviously recognized that Germany has done a lot in the last 2 years and come a long way. But you've just, I think, absolutely correctly underscored that Germany and Europe need to do more. They need to invest more in their own defense, but they also need to provide Ukraine with more support to help Ukraine prevail. And I feel in many senses that this is the same conversation or the same question that was being raised a year ago as we were looking at the 1-year anniversary of what does a victory mean for Ukraine? What does winning mean? But tying this into the German commitment to spend 100 billion on defense, tying it into Germany's pledge to support Ukraine. Yes, Germany can and should do more, but where do you see opportunities for Germany to make a bigger contribution and show leadership?
Um, this is not simply, or only, thanks for the question, Steve, and this only a question of money. I think what we should do and what we still lack, and what I'm still missing also from Berlin is, as you said, leadership in the sense that the EU, and that we understand that the EU must play a stronger role as an accelerator and facilitator, using financial incentives and regulatory measures to mobilize member states, and also discourage, of course, unnecessary duplication of efforts. I do miss these kind of discussions in political Berlin. There are, of course, those from the defense department and the military people who have pointing out and are arguing this way for a long time, actually, already in this country, but nothing happens. Even if most defense spending remains national, and there is no doubt that we have to increase also beyond the 110 billion, we, as you all know, we just discussed that last time already. Mm-hmm. This will, help us, and will, certainly make us survive for the next 2-3 years in terms of our obligation in terms of the 2% of GDP spending for defense. But what comes after that? So even if most defense spending, again, remains national, the EU can use its budgetary resources way more for defense research and technology, and to strengthen also manufacturing capacities by placing joint orders to defense companies through the European Defense Agency. I want to have discussion in this country because there is this German-French struggle about this issue to Europeanize our defense industry. I mean, this would be a crucial step. And don't get me wrong, particularly our American friends and colleagues, that does not mean and does not rule out, as you've seen, the deal with the F-35 launched by Scholz with the US, which has been very much criticized, as you probably all know, by the French government. So it's not an either or, it's an as well as a matter of fact. We have to do both. And I think this is what I see is there is this short-term thinking. There is the new administration in the U.S., and this seems to be, that means we are pretty much on the same page, and that means, of course, we now completely rely, or seem to almost exclusively rely on let's say, particular on the U.S. security umbrella.
Right.
And at the very next moment, and then maybe in 6-7 months, what comes Trump, if he would come back, actually, we would see how France and Germany would actually come, bind together again, and then would bound together again. And this is wrong. This is short term. This is short, and this is thinking. And we need to be, we need to really understand that this is, again, not either or. It is as well as. And I think to do so, placing these joint orders, get our European defense industry on track is the only way, also, by the way, to avoid, and I think this is also completely underestimated here, to avoid a U.S. retreat from NATO in the worst case scenario. As a matter of fact, only a strong Europe, I would say a more European NATO, might be able to adequately, and this is what we need to communicate. It's not always a question of just simply the money. It's of course a question of money, and it's of course a question of equipment. But we discussed it already, that this is due to, procurement, complicated procurement procedures, etc., bureaucracy, which is extremely harmful in this sense. So a more European NATO, which might be able to adequately at least compensate not a withdrawal, but a reduced American commitment, which I see in the near future. No matter who runs the White House, by the way, this will come. We discussed also the pivot to Asia, etc., etc. This will not disappear. We have to deal with it. We have to face it. And even if the alliance loses some transatlantic backing, this is what we need. And should the U.S. soften its commitment to provide, let me go even one step further. Maybe in the worst case, also soften its commitment to provide nuclear defense to Europe. What comes then? I mean, France and the UK are the only left, as you all know. And they also must revisit their contribution to deterrence. And we should not stand idle by and watch these two powers, leading this debate and the discussion. We should actually be way more open and proactively discuss it. We need to discuss it. This is what Germany should and could do. We all, and Europe and Germany in particular, will need to discuss effective policies that could prevent also nuclear escalation. So there are many issues, many aspects where Germany could actually push more. And in a nutshell, it's about a more European NATO, a Europeanized NATO. And it's about a better understanding here. And that, again, it's not either or, it's as well as. And that we should also reach out, I think, more to those in Europe, which are, which are not only talking about strategic autonomy, but who already realize that it will be inevitable for the future and in a medium and long-term perspective.
I mean, it seems to me that a lot of what you're talking about is how Europe can join forces to do more. And in a discussion that I had last night with a member of the Bundestag who was traveling in the US at the moment, he was also expressing concern about the US election and what might happen and how Europe can Trump-proof itself. But he also said that if Trump were to win the election, he anticipates a lot of action on the European front when it comes to finding or developing more progress on common foreign policy and common security. And I guess the question I would have for you is, as you think about where we are and where we need to be, it would be sort of ironic if it took Trump's re-election, to cause Europe to band together and do more when it could be doing that right now. So do you see any opportunities for Europe to do more in the short term, or is there just a lot of nail biting about what might happen in November in the US?
Stephen, I don't know who he or she was yesterday, or the MP you were talking to. But if I hear that, I mean, I get frustrated. Let me be very frank, because as I said and try to make clear, it's now. It has to happen now. And I see the same. I mean, only a really, really cautious, incrementally, increasing awareness here in political Berlin, that we need to face that. And I still do believe that we also completely underestimate that this the very complicated situation right now, also for the Biden administration, will prevail, even if he succeeds and will be reelected. I mean, we should get our expectations right. And that only means, once again, start now. Start now to seriously, and that means also communicate it to the people that what we definitely need is a more European NATO, a more capable. It's almost unbelievable that somebody, a member of the parliament, please don't get me wrong, or is raising this question, this issue, and arguing we should strengthen our CFSP, our CSDP, our Common Foreign Security Policy once this happens. I mean, it is.
So I might not have been completely clear. I think that his point was not let's wait and see, but was sharing some of your frustration in terms of things are not happening quickly enough. But I bet that if Trump is reelected, things will move very, very quickly all of a sudden, right?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, again, every month counts. I mean, starting the debate and discussion once, let's say he might be reelected or becomes, we will face another Trump presidency. I can see how our European leaders, political leaders, how they will struggle to have a plan B, and we should develop this plan right now. Reach out already now, if possible, as far as it is possible, to Washington, to those who actually in Congress. I mean, we know these debates. I mean, this is. It's easy to say that, or it's sometimes more difficult. I mean, because this requires mutual interest, of course, to talk together and think how we could cope with such a challenge. But this is what we need to do at that point.
Well, and as let me underscore, as you said, we can't wait months. As you said earlier, this really is a war of attrition that's being waged by Russia in Ukraine, and time is ticking, right? The clock is ticking. Definitely. And so it's important that there be action now. We've been talking mostly about the situation in Ukraine and the conflict with Russia, and one of our viewers is curious about your sense of what the long-term concepts or scenario could be for a sustainable and most importantly, stable European security architecture in the longer term. But that includes Russia, and it includes maybe a time when Putin is no longer in charge. Do you see some sort of a stable and sustainable European security architecture?
That, of course, I mean, I fully understand that people are raising that issue and that we have to discuss it. And I think you will have these discussions. As far as I could follow them, you have had them already in the US. In the last phase of this war of attrition, because what we are seeing, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I got, let's say, from watching this, that there is, of course, this is exactly the point I was mentioning at the very beginning. There are those who are already starting to argue, and we cannot have European or Euro-Atlantic security without Russia. And we need to come and get back at some point to the negotiation table, etc. But we are not the ones to determine when this will be and when this will happen. This is up to the Ukrainian people, as a matter of fact. Right. I mean, I'm not the only one or the first one who's saying that, and you've probably heard that several times also, of course, in your country. But we know that we are polarized on that issue. The societies and also politicians who wonder, I mean, how could that end and how will this finally end? I
Hmm.
personally do believe, and I would always argue, in the foreseeable future, if I look at Russian ambitions, I studied also, Russian foreign policy for quite a while, and dealing with that actually quite a lot. Um, and I've been, warning, as some of my colleagues also did, or ever since, you could say, I wouldn't say 2007-8, the famous Munich Security Conference speech given by Putin, but at least since 2014-15, that we should not have any illusions. There are so many
Hmm.
indicators that what Russia, what Putin has in mind, and he will not give up on these goals.
Hmm.
That clearly means, and by the way, he has signaled that to us once immediately after he took over government in 1998. What he said when he drafted his famous midterm strategy, or the answer to the European midterm strategy, it was clearly that he said, never expect us to somehow, maybe even in your most optimistic scenarios, that we will become an integral part of Europe, a European member,
Hmm.
even a European member or whatsoever. Forget about it. It's great power politics and thinking, and to be respected and accepted as a great power. And that means, at that point, I think, of course, we need to develop some at one
Hmm.
at one point we need to develop, of course, any system where we can, as to use a Russian framing or the Chinese framing, to develop something like peaceful coexistence, or to coexist peacefully. But at that point, and I think that goes also in the not only short term but in the medium term, I don't see European security with Russia. I only see it without Russia, frankly speaking, at that stage, at that point. And that
Hmm.
is actually what we have to deal with. This is a scenario we have to deal with. And this goes and works only if we, of course, do not give up what has been a strategy already during the Cold War period. And that means, yes, whenever there are signs that we might really engage with Russia, of course, don't miss a chance to do so. But as long as this doesn't happen, deter and
Hmm.
and clearly send out the message that we will defend Europe, and that is
Hmm.
at the moment, this is a European Union of 27. And as a matter of fact, I was really, really also, I forgot to mention, I think that's another important and interesting signal. I was mentioning the 53 billion package at the very beginning. I think it's also important to keep in mind that in the recent past, we've also seen quite promising, of course, signals by Europe to start negotiations with Moldova, Ukraine, etc., in terms of enlargement. That means, even if we should not give up on that, and I am sure that Americans will press us on that issue, because this is
Hmm.
definitely in their interest, their strategic interest, as a matter of fact. So I think we'll need to continue this process, and once again, this will not, at that stage, at that point, it will not work with Russia. It will actually only work without Russia, as I
Hmm.
see it right now.
Hmm. We've been talking, of course, a lot about security issues related to Ukraine, relations with Russia, NATO, um, but we haven't really gotten into the geoeconomics side
Yes.
of things and the challenge that poses. And I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about that, because I think that by definition, will they then get a little bit further into a conversation about systemic rivalry? Because obviously, right now, when thinking about different systems, Russia pops up. But both in this conversation and in our previous conversation, we didn't really talk that much about relations with China. And I think that definitely comes into play when thinking about the geoeconomic environment as well.
Yes, definitely, Steve. And I think also briefly mentioned last time. I think that is maybe will be the more even the greater challenge to us actually. I hope that we at least I think have understood, of course, a lesson, our lesson in terms of how do we deal and how do we have to cope with a Russian challenger that will contribute to deterrence on the eastern flank, etc. But I still do have my doubts with regard to the geoeconomic challenges, and the reason is that we here also have very different concerns within Europe. Some are way more dependent on China, particularly Germany, than others within the
Mhm.
European Union. So we do not have this kind of unity right now, as we do or seem to have with regard to Russia, let's say minus Orban and here and then
Mhm.
one or the other. A trouble maker within the European Union. So here again, I would like to throw into the debate three, I think, key points, what we have to do. I mean, everybody has heard about, and it's quite popular also in your country, about the issue of resilience, to become more resilient vis-a-vis, of course, China, but other countries, of course, as well, emerging countries. And let's not be mistaken here. Maybe also from a more hostile U.S. under Trump, as a matter of
Mhm.
fact. We have to cope with that, and we have to deal with that. That means Germany needs. That's another issue where I want to see leadership, and will be more difficult to see this kind of leadership because of Germany's high stakes and great stakes in China, as we all know. You're familiar with that, of course, and everybody knows it. So, but nevertheless, Germany needs to support the EU in building to the appropriate institutional framework to react to economic security risks, particular from China at
Mhm.
that point. And here, I think, first of all, I would say what is extremely so we have to enable Europe. We have to enable Europe to do so. We have to support Europe in every endeavor to do so. And I think that also implies, of course, that there cannot be any politics of equidistance as we used to have under the Merkel government. We have to be very clear on that. I mean, yes, the US has been protectionist in recent years, but the EU has been protectionist as well. All countries, I don't know of any country that hasn't been, let's say, industrial country, be protectionist at one or the other point or stage. Anyway, so this is an illusion. But nevertheless, we should see, of course, you know, there cannot be an as well as in this case it has to be an either or, and I do think that our future definitely does not only lie within Europe, but it
Mhm.
lies still lies with the US, even if this relationship is insecure and unstable right now. But we can do a lot to make it more stable, and that depends on us, and that means giving up on equidistance. Don't make the same mistake as in the case of Russia in terms of the energy dependencies. So this is something where we could do more. Economic security is mostly handled by member states
Mhm.
right now, not by the EU itself. And incongruent security policies on imports, exports, investments, financial flows pose a growing threat to the European economy in many ways. Take the digital sphere, where European countries manufacture relatively little of their own cloud computing systems,
Mhm.
e-software, telecommunications infrastructure, and instead depend on both American and Chinese products.
Mhm.
Or in cloud computing, where European sources where European sources, I think, really the lion's share from the US. So here, I think Germany should really join countries like France, Italy, and Spain, which rightly demand that cloud computing services may be exclusively provided by firms whose headquarters and staff are located in the EU. Not exclusively, but at least we should strengthen that as well. We need to be aware we should give up, should lose our dependencies. And Germany is still, I think, not really, let's say, lacks decisiveness actually in this question. And though we also, at least I have to admit, can see signs that we also start to worry, in particular, I said that last time already, our industries, that China is increasingly investing in European strategic infrastructure, illuminating the problem of having an integrated market without properly integrated security. There it is, what I just said before. Take the Netherlands example. In 2016, the Netherlands allowed major Chinese investments into the Rotterdam port. And in 2023, the China Ocean Shipping Company took a share in the port of Hamburg, as you probably heard in the case of Germany. But the EU could not formally weigh in on either the Dutch or the German decision, even though goods arriving in Rotterdam are not primarily destined for the Dutch market, but make their way throughout the entire European Union. Mm-hmm. So this is something where we, also have to give maybe even, selfish interests, as a matter of fact. And I'm very clear on that issue. Germany is the German industries and our politics has been also in recent years, particularly on that issue, not really proactively supported the EU's efforts, which are heading actually in the right direction. And I could add actually more, but maybe there are questions with regard to let's say weak export restrictions, sanctions policy, etc. The exporting of dual-use high-tech goods is often limited by individual countries, sometimes under pressure, of course, also from the United States. So this is where we need to work on, actually. And this is where I would love to see Germany, which is incrementally waking up, I would say, and realizing that. And I hope that Europe might actually, in the end, if we proceed this way, become more economically competitive by doing so. And on top of that, actually forging also, by the way, trade agreements with third markets, especially given the reluctance also from time to time from the US to define its trade policy. And so deepening the single market in this way is another very important issue and signal, would be an important signal by the European Union.
Let me maybe come back to one or two things that you said. I mean, one is obviously this challenge of reducing the resilience on China being important for Germany, but also important for Europe as a whole. It's certainly something that we were talking about in the US as well. I think coming out of the pandemic, there was a real realization of how dependent we were. And then, as part of that, there is this rhetoric around de-risking the relationship with China. Do you feel as if there's enough progress happening with that? And that sort of leads to a little bit of a disconnect that we're seeing in Germany's new China strategy, because it seems as if there's alignment in government about what the best practice is, but that vis-a-vis China, but that practice is not necessarily one that the private sector feels able to pursue, because it has different interests.
A good question. Thanks for that, Stephen. Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned this China strategy paper. As a matter of fact, which is a nice complement to also the European strategy of de-risking, which, by the way, which is quite interesting, does not explicitly address China, but is talking about others and protectionist countries which might do harm or might coerce the European Union, which we should actually address and which we should cope with. So it's interesting to see how to watch this kind of cautiousness to explicitly address China in many of these strategy documents. So at least there is a China strategy, and I think this is a good step. And I think de-risking, yes, this is an idea that has been which is also clearly and can be clearly found also in our national China strategy. I think Germany has realized that and is in this sense on the right track, and also ready to support the EU's more assertive role, which I was talking about already last time, because there have been examples only recently where Germany realized how far these dependencies, particularly on China, have gone and reached in recent years. Mm-hmm. Take the Dutch government's recent decision, for instance, to limit the export of Dutch lithography machines needed to produce top-performing semiconductor chips, mm-hmm. high-tech chips. Which affected the entire European Union. It required, for instance, for a German company, Zeiss, it's called Zeiss, to ensure that the components it supplies for those machines are not instead delivered directly to China, undermining the Netherlands' export restriction. And the German government has even been debating whether Germany's engineers who know how to develop these machines should be banned from working in China. Mm-hmm. This is a step you could have been thinking of, I think, only even a year ago or 2 years ago. So things are really changing. And the same goes for sanctions. The EU has been able to pass in recent years, and that all of them have been supported by Germany, 12, I think a dozen sanctions package against Russia. But the problem here still is, of course, that goes to the institutional nitty-gritties now, that unanimity requirements make all these decisions very slow. And that means, for that reason, very often enforcement remains in a short and medium term, quite imperfect. But I think it definitely goes into the right direction. There is a new awareness in this country. Among the industries, I think I mentioned last time that many of our companies have already incrementally withdrawn from the Chinese market in recent years. And you can see that, by the way, if you look at the shares and the numbers in terms of imports and exports in the last 1.5 years. So there is, I wouldn't say a great paradigm shift, but there is a new awareness. And I think there is more willingness in these days, particularly in political Berlin, to support the EU's and particularly the Commission's more assertive way in dealing with China and the challenges you mentioned. So yes, mm-hmm. I would say things are heading into, maybe slowly, too slow, but they're heading into the right direction, as a matter of fact.
So Stefan, we only have a few minutes left, and yes. I would love to sort of get your outlook, right? I mean, you've talked a little bit about where more needs to be done. I'm curious whether you have any sort of recommendations that could be described as low-hanging fruit, right? What would be things that could be implemented in fairly short order? Because obviously there's a lot to do. But I'd also like to come back to something that we talked about last time we spoke, which is, we've been talking largely about these big, overwhelming, overarching challenges in a global context. But how is this playing out at home? And last time we touched a little bit on having to win the hearts and minds of voters
Mm.
as well to support these kinds of policies. So again, first off, I'd be very curious to hear sort of your thoughts on whether there was any low-hanging fruit, whether there are any policy recommendations you would have in short order, but then also more broadly, how does one take this to the electorate? How does one take this to the people?
I think the last thing, Stephen, for that, the last point is crucial in that context. We need to convince the people and the public because all these steps I was talking about. I mean, they nevertheless. I know I said this sounds a bit contradictory. Actually, we do not have the time. On the other hand, particularly in the case of Germany, if it comes to the implementation and reconstitution of of our um, of our armies, of our defense industries, this will nevertheless take time, and that is a dilemma. So
Mhm.
we really do not only need a lot of money or more investment, but even more so, what we need is actually an acceleration of this whole process of the implementation. And there is no alternative to that. And meanwhile, we have to do everything. I think that is extremely relevant, crucial. This is why any signs of hesitation and insecurity with regard to where we stand, also with regard to vis-a-vis, particularly vis-a-vis Russia, is so important. As long as we need to develop, let me be very frank, these and as long as these steps, implementation steps, will take a while. We need to be sure
Mhm.
and convincingly send out signals to Moscow that we are willing to deter, that we're willing to do so, and willing to take the right steps. This is extremely relevant. And this is also true, of course, to counter, that is the second part of your question, to counter, of course, the rise you mentioned, and we discussed it last time when we were talking a little bit more about the domestic situation in both our countries, the rise of populism in countries such as France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain. By the way, I think that what I discussed before, the more economic integration, as I try to elaborate, can help also a lot in this sense, and
Mhm.
help also ordinary citizens to understand what is at stake. And so we should start, of course, and we need to prepare, and we are doing that. You probably follow, of course, they may be only small signs and signals, but look what's going on in this country right now. All these demonstrations, I'm sure you discussed it already. I mean, there is an awareness and sensibility, not only among politicians, but also among the public. It has finally reached and center stage, actually. And this is extremely relevant. We are starting to prepare now to withstand that pressure we were discussing last time internally,
Mhm.
gearing ourselves to better defend rule of law also within our borders,
Mhm.
actually, not only beyond, but particularly within our borders, and of course against autocratic systems threatening our societies with various means we discussed last time a little bit from aboard. So that is extremely relevant. At the same time, let me end up on that. I think it's also relevant, and this is also a situation similar to what the situation is, I think, in the US. If you follow the Biden rhetoric ever since he's been inaugurated in 2017, I think what we also see is, of course, sorry, to 2020. I think we should nevertheless, without giving up, let's say, on our principles, goals, etc. I know it sounds like, a little bit the typical German and European end note, but not at all. What I mean is we should really tone down our rhetoric with regard to democracy promotion on a global scale. Because what we need, we haven't also discussed extensively the issue of how do we, I was mentioning not only resilience, but also, of course, differentiation. Reach out to the so-called global south, whatever that means. As a matter of fact, we cannot discuss that here right now. But I think in that context, it's important. It's not only about an alliance of democracies, as Biden has suggested. We have to pursue a more pragmatic stance with regard to that. It's not only about the West in these days. This new world order actually is about many other actors, and we have to understand that. And I think it's extremely relevant that we tone down our rhetoric with regard to global democracy promotion or democracy approach on a global scale. Yes, we can do that and should do that in our direct neighborhood by using the most effective tool we have, EU enlargement.
Right.
But beyond that, and I think that's also new awareness in the US, we will not win, let me put it this way, in the future by still clinging to that idea, which does not mean that we personally or we ourselves need to give up on these principles. Let me end up on that note.
Well, that's a great way of tying the threads together and coming to an end. But let me ask one final question, because I think it ties together both the overarching sort of foreign policy, national security agenda, but also needs with some of those domestic concerns that we ended with. And that is after the big kerfuffle around the budget for Germany, the German government in 2023 and 2024, finally late last week, a budget was passed for 2024. And many of the things that we've talked about in our conversation today, of course, require funding as well. And that's funding that then is not available for some of the other issues and interests that people in the public have. As you've followed the budget negotiations, do you feel a greater sense of confidence now that Berlin has the wherewithal, that it has the Mittel, right, that it has the funds to implement some of its ambitious plans and can now buckle down and get on with some of the things that you've recommended?
Yes, the interesting thing is that there seems to be, and that was not the case only a couple of weeks, couple of months before, I would say until the end of 2023. I felt the idea and the common sense, the unity among the parties, also coalition parties, gathering around Scholz after his Zeitenwende Rede and speech. I felt that incrementally eroding over the last 2 years, actually. Now I see another impetus. Maybe this came to, I think it is interesting to see that exactly the debate we were having in the last couple of weeks. You were mentioning the budgetary issue and the new 2024 budget. There seems to be an agreement even from the Green Party. There were strong signals from Lindner and even the SPD, and also the SPD clearly signal this should not affect whatever we do. We still have to here and there do things that will not please everybody in this country. But there seems to be a common sense. I found that very, very interesting because they all stated and said this should not affect our defense budget, and we need to further invest and support the Ukraine. And I think I found that quite encouraging, actually, and I was very glad I heard this message. So I would love to see more of this debate, and particularly maybe also a greater understanding among those three coalition parties to really, sometimes, don't get me wrong, this maybe they may sound a bit cynical, to not quarrel and struggle about minor relevant issues. Let me put it mildly. I know the social budget is extremely relevant also in your country, and it is more than 50% also in our country, but there is a waste of money here and there, and you need a serious discussion on that. What are our priorities? What is more relevant? Again, in the end, you cannot have a stable society if you are surrounded by insecurity and insecurities from within, and this is something we need to communicate to the people way more, and the debate hopefully started a little bit, because what I could hear from political Berlin in recent weeks is, as I said, that there seems to be a common understanding that, particularly on the issue of defense and security, we need these kind of investments, and I hope this will prevail.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly seems to be a heightened awareness, and certainly people are following these issues. And I think that has been brought on by both the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, that these two external factors have had a tremendous impact on people's lives at home. Well, Stefan Fröhlich, it would be very easy to continue for another hour or so. This has been a fascinating and wide-ranging conversation. But I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to come back and follow up. I think we've been able to answer some of the open questions that we had at the end of the last session. But of course, you're also leaving us with other questions to think about for the rest of the day. And I'd also like to thank our viewers for tuning in and for engaging with questions and comments of your own.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.